Kevin just read the words of the prophet Malachi. Malachi is the last of all the prophets in the book of prophets, in the book of Nevi'im. And he read from the last portion of Malachi's prophecy. And this is how the books of the prophets end, with these words. Hinei anochi sholeach lachem et Eliya navi. I will send the prophet Elijah to you, Lifnei bo yom Adonai hagadol ve'anora, before the coming of the awesome, fearful day of Adonai. Ve'eshiv lev avot al banim, ve'lev banim al avotam. And Elijah shall reconcile parents with children, and children with their parents. Pen avo ve'iketi et haaretz cherem, so that it do not come and strike the whole land with utter destruction. That's how the prophecies end. And the understanding of this, conventional understanding of this prophecy, is that in the world as it currently is, unredeemed, parents and children remain distant and estranged from one another. The prophecies that Elijah will return the heart of the parents to the children and the hearts of the children to the parents, and that he will bring about a great reconciliation between the generations. The Pesach Seder, which we are about to celebrate in just a couple of days, is designed as an opportunity for a conversation, for an encounter, for dialogue, for learning between parents and children, an opportunity for meaningful intergenerational interaction. And in this interaction, what happens is the transmission of memory and of the Jewish narrative, but not just the transmission of the Jewish narrative of old, but the constant weaving of the Jewish narrative as it continues to happen. That's what happens at the Seder table. We use the old story of Yetziat Mitzrayim and we build on it and extract new meaning and understand it from the perspective of what is going on now in our lives. And we continue to move forward, to expand and fold the story of our people. Parents and children, I mean, if you open the Haggadah, that's what it's about. Ma nishtana halayla hazeh. The child asks, the parent responds, but then they engage in conversation, questions and answers. Bechol dor vador. In each generation, you can see these words really capturing the sense that it's an encounter, intergenerational encounter. The story of Yetziat Mitzrayim, of our coming out of Egypt, is the foundational narrative of the Jewish people. It is formative of who we are. It is at the core of our identity as Jews. The story of Yetziat Mitzrayim shapes our collective memory. That's why it's so important. That's why the Seder is so important. So many Jews who otherwise would not necessarily engage in Jewish practice, they participate, they're present on the night of the Seder around the table because they know that this story shapes and continues to shape our collective memory. In her book on the book of Exodus, the great teacher and scholar Rabbi Zornberg cites a teaching of a great rabbi of the 20th century who was born in Poland, lived here, and then was teaching for many years in Israel, Rabbi Tzchak Hutner. In his book, Pachat Yitzchak, Rabbi Hutner notes the difference between the words that are used in the biblical text at the beginning of the book of Genesis in the story of creation, where the dominant word is Vayomer, Elohim yehi or, vayomer. The word vayomer, amar, to say. But then when the narrative turns to the book of Exodus, in the section of the Ten Commandments, the recurrent word is not vayomer, for God said, but vayedaber. God said vayedaber. The difference between amar and diber. Vayomer, vayedaber. And you can hear these words if you read the narrative of the giving of the Ten Commandments and the presence at Sinai. You can hear the word daber repeats and recurs. Rabbi Hutner notes that difference, and he says the following. He discusses the Kabbalistic notion of the movement from the 10 sayings, the Ma'amarot, Vayomer, with which the world was created, to the 10 speakings, Dibrot, of the 10 Commandments at Sinai. And he says that the first, this is a Kabbalistic teaching, that the first form of speech, Vayomer, is soft. The second, Vaidaber, is hard. Its aim is to have an impact on the other. And he says, a new era begins at Mount Sinai, one in which God's love is expressed in demands for mature responses. God speaks and expects a response and growth on the part of human beings. God gives the commandment and expects that we are going to step up and that we are going to engage with the commandments in order to refine ourselves and our souls. And he says that the moment of Pesach, of coming out of Mitzrayim, marks the moment of transition from the Vayomer to the Vaidaber forms of speech. And this transition happens at the moment of Pesach, and that it's captured in the seder with a hard-edged questioning by the children at the seder. It's the first time that there's some sort of hard-edged questioning that happens. And Aviva Zornberg says the ability to question must now govern the relationship between God and humans as between parents and growing children. The aim of the relationship is to create, in Rabbi Hutner's imagery, the face of one who can receive, who actively generates meaning by asking questions. Now the dialogue is the model for evoking narratives. Without the capacity to ask, to open up the closed issues, to break through the obvious, the self-understood, there can be no meaningful narrative. In other words, the narrative is generated by breaking through, by questioning, by asking, by exploring, by seeking to respond. In terms of Rabbi Hutner's analysis, says Aviva Zornberg, the 4 children in the Haggadah represents an essential dynamic in the transmission of memory. Someone must ask a question. Someone must become aware of a difficulty, a blank, a dissonance. The worst case in this view is the son who does not know how to ask. In such a case, at petachlo, you open for him. But this opening is by default an act of Haggadah, of telling, an unsolicited narrative which represents a failure in the dynamic of the narrative that is engendered by question. This child doesn't know how to ask. And so the parent has to create the narrative without the child having asked, which is a failure. Because the ideal is for children to begin with a question. This is what is meant to happen at the seder. The questions, the opening up of closed issues, the breaking through the surface of the obvious, the give and take, the creation of a meaningful narrative. This is what's meant to happen, but not what is happening these days in many homes and between the generations of our people. This year in particular, after October 7th, many people are dreading the dynamics at the seder, dreading where the conversations will go. This year finds us divided generationally, and I've heard of people in this community who have come to sought advice and to figure out how they can contain the conversation on Monday night around the seder table. People are really concerned of what will happen on Monday night when the question of, for example, who is Pharaoh today, will arise. This past December, there was an article in the New York Times, many of you I'm sure read it. Jewish American families confront a generational divide over Israel. And it says, Gen Z and young millennials often see Israel as an occupying power oppressing Palestinians, a shock to their parents and grandparents who tend to see it as an essential haven fighting for survival. For at least half a century, American Jews, the substantial majority of whom tend to be liberal and vote Democratic, have largely supported Israel across the spectrum of age, partisanship, and religious denomination. Recent polling suggests that that is changing, and that is reflected around the table at the Passover Seder. Even before October 7th, according to a 2021 Pew Research survey, younger American Jews were generously less attached to Israel than their parents and grandparents. A survey that the Democratic pollster GBAO Strategies conducted in November, after October 7th, this past November, a few weeks after the start of the war, found a striking generation gap in American Jews' attitude toward President Biden's strong support for Israel. 82% of those 36 or older supported the president, 82%. But only 53% of those 15 to 20 to 35 felt that way. The man who conducted the survey, Jim Gerstein, said that younger American Jews have little or no memory of an underdog Israel surrounded by enemy states or terrorized by suicide bombings. Instead, they grew up when Israel had developed into a thriving economic and regional military power backed by the United States and largely insulated from its neighbors, a perspective that inclined them to judge Israel more harshly, especially under the conservative leadership of Prime Minister Netanyahu. Jewish voters are very liberal, and younger Jews even more so, and hold a different perspective of Israel than older generations, the pollster said. As the violence escalates in the Middle East, turmoil of a different kind is growing in this part of the world. Many young American Jews are confronting the region's long-standing strife in a very different context, with very different pressures from their parents' and grandparents' generations. The Israel of this young generation has been powerful, no longer appearing to some to be under constant existential threat. The violence comes after a year when mass protests across the United States have changed how many Americans see issues, have changed how many Americans see issues of racial and social justice. The pro-Palestinian position has become more common, with prominent progressive members of Congress offering impassioned speeches in defense of the Palestinians on the House floor. At the same time, reports of anti-Semitism are rising across the country. On November 9th, the Brookings Institute published an opinion piece called "The Generation Gap in Opinions Towards Israel." Nearly a month into the war that began with Hamas invasion of Israel, overall public opinion in favor of the United States support of Israel remains strong. But at recent demonstrations on college campuses around the country indicate there is a generational divide. Even before the Hamas invasion, there were distinct generational differences in Americans' attitudes towards Israel. These differences are mirrored by divergences between older and younger Jewish Americans. There are signs that these gaps have widened since the current conflict began. That's why so many people are concerned about what will happen around the table this Monday night. While some younger Americans are increasingly aware of the hardships that many Palestinians have had to endure, others are echoing long-standing anti-colonial narratives popular on the far left and calling, as does Hamas, for the outright destruction of Israel. At the same time, some young American Jews feel distant from the story of Israel's founding and the Jewish struggle to gain the recognition of a homeland, while also having to cope with a historic explosion of anti-Semitism. For many younger Americans, the current bloodshed is their first experience with a conflict that has been going on for more than 75 years. The coming months are likely to have profound impact on the attitudes they will carry with them through their lives. That's from the Brookings Institute. So what do we do? How do we sit around the table, those of us who very profoundly feel this generational divide and fear an explosion at the table, or people walking out? I turn to my wise friend, Rabbi Erwin Kula, who wrote a wonderful essay called Trapped by Trauma, published by Klal in an online publication called The Wisdom Daily. This essay is called Trapped by Trauma, Transcending the Dragon's Gaze. He says that recent advances in cognitive science, for example, the work of Daniel Kahneman and Ian McGilchrist, explain why there are these clashes between, in this case, generations. We are far less rational than we believe. Our views and opinions, our reasons and rationales are intimately and integrally related to our feelings. Much of our thinking is an instantaneous response to unconscious emotions. When threatened, we are flooded with painful feelings like fear, anxiety, sadness, disgust, and shame. In response, the best of us, wherever we are on the political spectrum, from reactionary, tribal, to progressive, universal, defend against the too muchness of our psyche by doubling down on inherited strategies that worked to get us to the present moment. Doubling down, that's what happens at the table. When we feel attacked, when we feel angry, when we feel that we are burning inside, we double down, and our feelings get expressed as opinions or as thinking, but really it's about feelings. But by definition, our views cannot include every aspect of a complex reality. And so we inevitably curate, filter, and exclude facts. That's all of us. It's very difficult to hold a complex reality. So we curate, we select, we filter, we exclude facts, the anomalies that cause cognitive resonance, dissonance. When overwhelmed by painful and threatening feelings, we tend to carve the world to clearly define the right and wrong, good and evil, and turn our existing views into certainties. All of us. The most prevalent way to banish or numb painful feelings of vulnerability, precariousness, and shame is with self-protective expressions of aggression, rage, and violence. An intellectual aggression that cuts a person down, cancels people, or excludes them from the community can be as damaging to the body politic as the physical sword is to the body. Situations of war, like we're experiencing now, requires each of us as individuals and groups, not to reflexively become more certain about our existing worldviews, beliefs, and opinions, but to examine our own trusted categories, lenses, and frameworks. And this goes for everyone, for parents, for children, for the older generation and the younger one. And so here's what I suggest for those of us who are dreading Monday night. To sit at the table and take a very deep breath. Throughout the evening, to be self-aware and to be willing to be vulnerable. To ask with real curiosity. To listen actively and intentionally. To speak and to let others speak. To try to leave our certainties aside. To stretch our minds and hearts and be aware of the tremendous complexion of reality. And therefore to be capable of holding more than one truth, more than our own truth, more than one trauma, more than one suffering. To ask ourselves and each other to tolerate being in the messiness and the complexity. Our tradition asks us to do this all the time. It is the hardest and most demanding part of our spiritual practice. To live in the messiness and the complexity. And here is an example. At the seder tables, the matzah, or during the Passover, the matzah symbolizes the bread of affliction, lechem oni, and the bread of liberation, both at the same time. We hold the complexity. It's neither this nor that exclusively, it's both at the same time. How could it be? Well, that's the paradox that our tradition asks us to hold. Our consciousness on Pesach, and as Jews in general, dwell simultaneously in the trauma of enslavement and in the miracle of liberation. That's what Pesach is about. We're both in the experience of the oppression and the enslavement and in the miracle of liberation at the same time. We live in the awareness of the permanent threat of exile, oppression and destruction in the present, and at the same time, in the promise of redemption. Both are part of the Jewish consciousness and what it means to be Jewish. And so we are asked to be in two places at the same time, in our minds, in our consciousness, in our heart. And I hope we can, those of us who will find ourselves in that situation on Monday night, to be able to hold that complexity and to carry through and to remember Veshiv lev abot al banim, that Elijah will help us do that, but we have to also help do it ourselves, to return the heart of the parents to the children, velev banim al avotam, and the heart of the parents to the children. Because the alternative is pen avo veiketi et haaretz cherem. If that doesn't happen, we will certainly face the destruction of these relationships which are precious and which we should treasure and preserve. Chag Sameach to all.